Hi investors, welcome to SOIC. So in today's business analysis, we'll be talking about Asian Paints, the competitors that are coming up for Asian Paints, and what is Asian Paints doing to defend itself. Then we'll also look at the risk factors in the business, the thesis pointers, and also finally the valuations of the business. And along with that, we will understand the basics of paint industry, and we'll start with the basics of paints industry first. So starting with the basics of paints industry, let me show you a wall with a paint. All of you can see the wall with a paint, right? Now let me ask you, which company's paint was used on this wall? The answer is you won't be able to tell. This is the reason why paint industry is one of the most difficult industries to penetrate in the world. Reason number one is that if a customer cannot tell the brand which the customer has used, then most probably the competitive advantages are built on the supply side. And paint industry is nothing different because paint industry involves a lot of supply chain optimization. Second thing what matters is the dealers and the influencers who are involved in the entire paint value chain, they need to be conquered, and this is what Asian Paints has done over a long period of time. And third thing what matters is the element of branding, because you as a customer, you will get your house repainted once every 4 or 5 years. So you want to get that paint which is the best quality for your house. So there will be only 3 or 4 brands which will be on top of your mind, and if you go to your painter or if you go to an interior designer or an architect, they end up becoming the key decision makers for you. And what will they look for? They will look for a paint or a paint company which can supply them with paint at the shortest possible period of time. So this is why paint industry ends up becoming really difficult to do. So what does the value chain of the paint industry look like? So this is something that you need to find out. So if you look at the value chain of the paints industry, first there are raw material suppliers. Which type of raw materials? So paint is made out of titanium dioxide, crude oil, HDPE and VAM. VAM is also another raw material, and raw materials comprises 60% of the manufacturing process for a paint. After that, there are contract manufacturers and brand owners of paint. So like Asian Paints having its own facility, today it has 26 plants, 26 to 27 plants, and then it can also get its paints contract manufactured by some of the other companies. And then there are direct customers. Suppose if an institution chooses to buy paint, and then there are dealers and distributors, and then there are people like you and me who end up buying from dealers and distributors, that is retail customers. So this is how the value chain of the paints industry looks like. But why is paints industry, or why is the paints business difficult to do? And why did Sherwin-Williams, which entered this business in 2005 and 6 in India, why did it end up failing? Simple reasons are that paints industry involves a lot of small points of competitive advantages. I keep calling these things mini modes. That what ends up happening is that you need to have these small things in place, and these small things, they add up to one large picture. And having those small things in place ends up becoming extremely complex. So just to give you an example, now suppose if I go to a dealer, right? Now that dealer's shop is very small in size. So what paint is, it's a very high voluminous product. So the quantity or the weight of the paint is very high. Whereas the price of the paint which it sells at is not so high as compared to the volumes of the paint. So a dealer ends up making money on that company or on that particular brand where the inventory turns are the highest for the dealer. Suppose a dealer is able to sell 4 buckets of Asian Paints paint, whereas some other non-existent company is only able to sell 2 buckets. Because of inventory turns, dealer will make superior profits on Asian Paints. So this is one of the reasons why it's difficult. Second reason why it is difficult is that suppose if Asian Paints has the tinting machine installed at the shop, you can look at how a tinting machine looks like. Because in the tinting machine, whatever color you want, basically you can get it mixed and you get it out of a tinting machine. But what ends up happening is that tinting machine area is also limited in a shop. Now suppose a friend of mine, he has 2 tinting machines in his shop. So now a third paints company recently approached him to install a tinting machine. But his simple answer was that I already have 2 tinting machines and already my sales are really good. So I won't be stocking your tinting machine. So this is also an entry barrier which exists in the industry. Third entry barrier which exists within the industry is having multiple manufacturing plants and having multiple distribution outlets throughout the country. And why is it important? Because suppose if you have a dealer or a distributor and he wants a particular type of paint or he wants a particular type of product. Now, if you do not have your manufacturing plant close to the dealer, then it will take n number of days for you to supply that particular product. But now suppose if Asian Paints has that particular plant or that particular manufacturing unit close to the dealer and it promises to supply that particular product within 4 to 6 hours, that is where Asian Paint ends up winning as compared to the competitors. If you just look at this data point, so this will actually prove the point, is that if you look at supply chain schedules, so for Asian Paints, it is 4 to 6 hours after placing the order, the dealer gets the paints. And incentive margins are lower as compared to other companies, 3 to 5%. Whereas if you look at the supply chain schedule for Indigo Paints is 12 to 24 hours, for Akzo Nobel is 12 to 24 hours, for Berger Paints is 12 to 24 hours, and for Kansai Nerolac also is 12 to 24 hours. Even inventory days for Asian Paints are 6 to 10 days, for Kansai Nerolac these are 15 to 18 days, Berger Paints 15 to 18 days, and also Akzo Nobel 15 to 20 days, and Indigo Paints at 15 to 18 days. So this is one of the reasons why Asian Paints ends up winning. And also one of the key things to consider is complex management of SKUs. So in the paints business, there are many stock keeping units. So because there are so many products, so it ends up becoming a very complicated exercise in managing your supply chain. So this is where the excellence stands out, because over the years you have collected the data and you know the demand patterns of customers much better than your competitors, or you know the demand patterns of a city much better as compared to your competitors. So this also adds up to the competitive advantage in the paints business. And finally, the paints business has this competitive advantage of economies of scale. As your size and scale grows, which we'll find out in the video as well, as your size and scale grows, your costs keep falling as a percentage of your sales. Now suppose if Asian Paints is doing 900 crores on advertising and their sales are close to 33,000 crores today, so it will be barely 2 to 3% for them. But I want to set up a paints business. So first, I do not have 900 crores to spend on advertising. And second, neither my top line is close to 33,000 crores. So it's a business which takes decades to build, or which take multiple years to build, or which will take massive amount of investment to build. So with this massive amount of investment, we can talk about Grasim and JSW Paints, which are trying to enter this industry. And in the later part of the video, I'll do a detailed competitive analysis. So let's find out how Asian Paints was started and what was the history of the business. So Asian Paints was started in 1942. So why 1942? Because during that time there was World War II which was going on. And because of World War II, there was a ban on the import of paints. So sensing this market vacuum, 4 friends started Asian Paints together. So who were these 4 friends? One is Champaklal Choksi, second is Chimanlal Choksi, third is Arvind Vakil, and fourth is the Dani family. Out of these 4 promoters, 3 promoter families still are in the business, whereas Champaklal Choksi's family is not a part of the business anymore. Because in 1990s, Atul Choksi, who was the son of Champaklal Choksi, sold 9% of his stake, and Atul Choksi went and headed Aapka Industries, which is also a listed company. So this is the family background of Asian Paints. But why did Asian Paints end up winning such a huge market? Simple reason is that between 1940s to 1970s or 1980s, the number of paint manufacturers which were there in India, all of them were focusing on institutional business, marine paints and industrial paints. There was no company which was focusing on decorative paints. So ideally at that point of time, for houses, the most popular paint used to be distemper, जिसको चूना के नाम से भी कहते हैं. So there wasn't such appetite to spend on paints. But Asian Paints started out the business, and it started out its business through rural towns, because distributors in the main cities like Mumbai and Delhi didn't want to stock up Asian Paints products. So they started out by distributing products in rural India. And within rural India, they got very good brand acceptance. And from rural India, over a period of time, they went to urban India. And they had this massive collection of data as well. Because paint industry at the end is also about supply chain. Another reason is, if you look at one of their key competitors, that is Jensen and Nicholson. So Jensen and Nicholson actually diversified from the paints industry, because they went into banking business, finance business. They also entered n number of other businesses. And even other competitors like Garware Paints or Shalimar Paints, they didn't have their eyes firmly set on the paints business. Even they ended up diversifying. But Asian Paints since the beginning only stuck to one angle and focused only on one business, that is the paints business. And secondly, if you look at Asian Paints journey, out of all the listed paints company in India, if you look at the major listed paints companies in India, then Asian Paints is one of the only companies where has there been no change in ownership. So there is no change in ownership with Asian Paints, whereas with Berger Paints there has been change in ownership, whereas with Kansai Nerolac there has been change in ownership, whereas with Akzo Nobel there has been change in ownership, and even with Shalimar Paints there has been change in ownership. So having the same management for almost 8 decades gives you a lot of continuity in business. And this management also decided that they need to professionalize. So in 1960s and 1970s, they hired professional management and they focused a lot more on supply chain efficiencies. So over a period of time, what has happened, as we mentioned in the key competitive advantages of Asian Paints, is that they have the largest number of manufacturing units in India. They have the largest or the highest revenue per manufacturing unit in India. They have the largest number of depots in India. And also one thing to be sure of, that they have the largest number of dealers in India, which we'll talk about in P2P analysis as well. So one of the key DNAs for Asian Paints since the beginning has been innovation and branding. So what is innovation? I'll just give you 2 simple examples to explain that how by focusing on details and how by focusing small products, they can still capture the market. So one example is that in Tamil Nadu, there's a festival by the name of Pongal. And during Pongal, the villagers find it auspicious to paint the horns of the bull. So Asian Paints in 1950s or 60s focused on this market and actually made a paint which is only meant to paint the bull horns, because the paint easily wears off. So they decided that we'll make a paint which wears out over a period of time because the bull uses its horn. So that is one of the key things that they did, and they compromised on margins to ensure the quality of the product was superior. And second thing that they did, that in 1960s and 1970s, again in Tamil Nadu, if you go to any house in Tamil Nadu, so just below the doorstep, there is a paint which is colored red and yellow, which is considered auspicious. So even to capture this market, Asian Paints launched a particular paint. So this gives you an idea of innovation and catering to market needs and the cultural needs of India. Second thing which Asian Paints did, it has focused a lot on branding. So in 1954 and 1955, it launched a brand mascot by the name of Gattu. And that is made by R.K. Lakshman, who's one of the eminent cartoonists in India. And over a period of time, for the last 4 to 5 decades, this mascot has been used in a lot of branding advertisements. So we'll see in P2P analysis that how much Asian Paints is spending on advertising. But this is what the DNA of the organization is, and there is no wonder if you look at the EPS of Asian Paints, it has consistently grown every year for the last several decades. For the last 3 decades, the company has been growing. Now, if you look at the total addressable market of the paints industry, so currently out of the entire paints industry in India, 70 to 75% of the industry is organized in nature, whereas only 25% of the industry is unorganized in nature. So Indian decorative organized paint industry is estimated to be somewhere between 40 to 45,000 crores, and it is expected to grow at a rate of 8 to 10%. And similarly, Asian Paints has been growing its volumes for the last decade at somewhere between 12 to 14%. And what are the key reasons why the Indian paints industry is growing? Main reasons are repainting demand, housing demand, urbanization, aspirations are growing, and also premiumization. And if you look at Indian paints per capita consumption, so per capita consumption of paints and coatings is close to 4.1 kgs in India, whereas this is 15.8 kgs in USA, and this is also 6 kgs in Indonesia. So this is how the total addressable market is like. See, even currently, after many years of growth, even currently nearly 1/4 of the industry is still unorganized in nature. So this is one data point that you have to keep in mind. Now coming to the revenue sources of Asian Paints and number of manufacturing plants that they have. So currently, if you look at the number of manufacturing plants that Asian Paints has, so it has close to 26 to 27 manufacturing plants, and these manufacturing plants are spread throughout India. So you can see they have a plant in Rohtak, Haryana, they have a plant in Uttar Pradesh, they have a plant in Gujarat, they have a plant in Maharashtra, Telangana, Andhra Pradesh, Karnataka, Tamil Nadu, and also they have a plant in again one more in Tamil Nadu, Gujarat and Taloja. Whereas if you look at the revenue mix of Asian Paints, then you will find that in terms of revenue mix, 85% of the revenues come from the decorative paints, that is products like interior and exterior wall paints, wood and metal finishes, waterproofing. So recently they've also entered waterproofing. This is something that we need to remember. Tools, adhesives and wall coverings. Whereas if you look at international business, so this is spread across Middle East, South Pacific, Africa through 7 corporate brands, and over here they have close to 10% of the business which comes from international businesses. Then if you look at the industrial business, which is a joint venture with PPG paints company, which is from USA. So currently it is 2.5% of the business, and it is purely meant for industrial coatings. And if you look at kitchen and bath business, which they've recently acquired in 2015, so that is Sleek for modular kitchens and SS. So these are close to 2.6% of the entire sales, that is 761 crores. So this is how the revenue split of Asian Paints looks like. So one interesting observation has been that within the building material business, because all these businesses are running on the power of distribution, that all these businesses are trying to enter adjacencies. Like example of Astral. So Astral entered adhesives, whereas Pidilite entered waterproofing and is a market leader over there. And from waterproofing, it is now also planning to enter paints. Whereas similarly, what Asian Paints is also doing is that Asian Paints is entering into adhesives, and also they are encroaching each other's territories. So this is very, very interesting, and we have to see how the industry evolves, that if even more and more players keep entering paints. And this is something that we'll talk about in the second part of the video, where we'll also see that why JSW Paints and Grasim Industries have entered this industry. But this is one trend which is happening within the paints industry and within the building material industry at large. Astral also recently acquired one of the paints players, and also it has plans to scale up its paints business as well. Now, before going forward, 4 key problems that a retail investor encounters. So first biggest problem is that the 3 W's of investing are really terrifying for a retail investor. What are those 3 W's? That is when to buy, when to sell, and when to pivot. So these 3 W's are the most important 3 W's of investing. Second key problem for a retail investor is we do not know how to find intrinsic value of a stock. That what is intrinsic value of a stock? Third biggest problem that arises for a retail investor is that there are so many ways to find a stock that we do not know which one to use, because there are multiple ways to find which type of stock idea we should be studying. And fourth key problem for a retail investor is that we do not know the language of business, that is accounting. So all these key 4 problems I've solved for you in one SOIC membership, where all these key 4 problems are solved in different levels for you, and all these key 4 problems will be addressed. All the past webinars and the future webinars are part of one SOIC membership, and if you want to sign up for the SOIC membership, the link is in the description below, and you can use the coupon code SOIC Paints 10. It is purely meant for the viewers of this video. Now with this, we'll go to the P2P analysis, and we'll see how Asian Paints stacks up against Berger Paints, Kansai Nerolac, Indigo Paints and some of the other peers. तो हम एक बार एशियन पेंट्स का P2P एनालिसिस करते हैं. तो पीयर टू पीयर एनालिसिस में क्या करेंगे, जो हमने कंपेटिटिव एडवांटेजेस की बात करी एंड ऑल्सो वी टॉक्ड अबाउट अभी तक कि क्या एंट्री बैरियर्स है बिजनेस में, वो आपको एंट्री बैरियर्स एक पॉइंट के अंदर मैथमेटिकली यू विल स्टार्ट फाइंडिंग देम. सो फर्स्ट P2P एनालिसिस पॉइंटर इज नंबर ऑफ रिटेल पॉइंट्स. सो व्हाट डू वी मीन बाय नंबर ऑफ रिटेल पॉइंट्स? दैट नंबर ऑफ रिटेलर्स थ्रू व्हिच एशियन पेंट्स इज एबल टू डिस्ट्रीब्यूट इट्स प्रोडक्ट्स. So with the nearest competitors and with the third and fourth largest player, you'll see a massive difference between it. So Asian Paints has close to 150,000 retail points. Whereas if you look at Berger Paints has close to 58,000 retail points, Kansai Nerolac has 28,000 retail points, and Indigo Paints has 16,785 retail points. And actually, if you read the conference call of Indigo Paints, so Indigo Paints also talks about this point, that Indigo Paints only has close to 7,500 to 7,600 tinting machines installed. So we spoke about this, that why tinting machine is a very, very important aspect when it comes to building entry barriers. Because a retailer won't ideally keep more than 1 or 2 tinting machines, because tinting machines, they take up a lot of area within the shop. So the retailer will only prefer to stock up those goods which get sold very automatically. And secondly, a retailer will only prefer to keep 1 or 2 tinting machines. So this ends up becoming an entry barrier within the industry. So post Grasim has announced the capex, we'll talk about Grasim. So Asian Paints in last 3 years has actually nearly doubled the retail points it is catering to. One of the reasons for doing this is so that Asian Paints doesn't give any market vacuum to any new competitor who can come and actually acquire the retailers which Asian Paints currently hasn't acquired. So this is the first key point of P2P analysis. Coming to the second key point of P2P analysis, that is the amount that is spent on advertising. So why does advertising end up becoming a very important factor in the paints industry? Because paints industry is again about influencing the behavior of customers. So when it comes to advertising costs, even Berger Paints and Asian Paints, both these companies are nearly spending 3% of their top line. But what is very important is that Asian Paints, because the top line is much larger than Berger Paints, so Asian Paints advertising cost is somewhere close to 943 crores per annum. This was in FY22. For Berger Paints, it is close to 271.3 crores. For Kansai Nerolac, it is close to 243 crores. For Indigo Paints, it is close to 88 crores. So this is why economies of scale matters in this business, because Asian Paints is a larger player as versus Indigo Paints. So you can see how Asian Paints has nearly 10x the amount that is spent on advertising versus Indigo Paints. So this gives you a very good idea that why this is a business of scale. And in spite of that, if you just check that advertising as a percentage of sales for Indigo Paints, it is 9.71%. For Asian Paints, it is still 3.24%. So this is why Indigo Paints will have lower margins than Asian Paints, because Asian Paints naturally has economies of scale. What is the beauty of economies of scale? As your business grows in size, the expenses that you're incurring, they keep falling as a percentage of your total sales. So this is how you can see economies of scale which gets built into businesses. And this is exactly what will reflect in EBITDA margins of all the paint companies. If you look at EBITDA margins of Asian Paints, Berger Paints, Kansai Nerolac, and also like Indigo, so FY22 was a difficult year because crude oil prices increased a lot, and also the key raw material prices increased a lot. And if you look at EBITDA margins of Asian Paints, Berger Paints, Kansai Nerolac, and Indigo, this is where economies of scale will start reflecting itself. If you look at EBITDA margins of 9-month FY23, Asian Paints EBITDA margins were close to 17.16%. Berger Paints EBITDA margins were close to 13.77%. Kansai Nerolac was at 11.18%, whereas Indigo Paints was at 14.68%. So again, Asian Paints stands apart as compared to rest of the players. And also if you look at the raw material consumption expense, that if you're just spending money on cost of goods sold, so what is the cost of goods sold? So this is very important metric, that paints industry is an industry where average gross margins are somewhere between 38 to 42%. Whereas if you look at Asian Paints gross margin or cost of goods consumed, so in FY23 it increased to 62% because crude oil prices increased. So this is why gross margins fell to 37 to 38%. Berger Paints 64% or 65% was spent on cost of goods sold. So gross margins fell to 35%. Kansai Nerolac gross margin fell to 30%. Whereas in Indigo Paints case, because it's a very subscale player, so currently the gross margins are higher, close to 44 to 43%. But this gives you an idea when we are doing P2P analysis, is that all these players, the average gross margin band for the pan-national players like Berger Paints and also like Asian Paints is somewhere between 38 to 42%. Then if you look at the capacities which all these players have built over a long period of time, so this is where it will become very interesting, because when we'll be talking about the entry of JSW and Grasim, so this will be a very key pointer to analyze. If you look at the capacity of Asian Paints, how many plants that they have and how much capacity of paint that they're producing. So currently Asian Paints all over the country, currently it has a capacity of 17.3 lakh kiloliters. Whereas if you look at Berger Paints, the capacity is 7.4 lakh kiloliters, Kansai Nerolac 5.83 lakh kiloliters, whereas Indigo Paints only has a capacity of 1.1 lakh kiloliters. And also what becomes important is that post the entry of Grasim and JSW, Asian Paints has announced huge expansions. Why have they announced huge expansions? Because again, you have to defend your turf and you are the incumbent. Incumbent is someone who's already dominating the industry and who's existing over there. So if you look at the incremental capacity expansion that is coming up in the industry, first let's look at Asian Paints and the capex plan. So Asian Paint is currently spending close to 8,750 crores. First is to backward integrate into the key raw materials which are imported into India right now. Second thing that they're doing right now is that they're also expanding their paints capacity by doing a greenfield and a brownfield capex. So current capacity is 17.3 lakh kiloliters, which will increase by 9.4 lakh kiloliters post both the completion of brownfield and greenfield capex, which will take their overall capacity to 26 lakh kiloliters. Berger Paints is doing almost nearly a 50% capacity expansion of its plant of its units as well. So from 7.4 lakh kiloliters to 3.96 lakh kiloliters. Kansai Nerolac is doing a 290 crore capex, that is 17,000 kiloliters they are adding. Whereas Indigo Paints is just nearly adding 50% of its capacity. Berger Paints has the second largest capex plan, that is close to 1000 crores, and Kansai Nerolac has barely a capex plan of 290 crores. So this is with the P2P analysis. If you look at the organized paints industry and the market share which has moved between Asian Paints, Berger Paints, Kansai Nerolac and also Indigo, so this is what you will find. So looking at the market share of Asian Paints versus Berger versus Nerolac versus AkzoNobel, which is also known as the Dulux. So if you just look at the market share, so then we find that in FY02, that is 2002, the market share of Asian Paints used to be 44.5%. And actually this market share dipped in FY05 to 44.2%. Whereas if you look at FY09, the market share increased to 54.2%. Then FY14, the market share increased to 54.3%. And by FY19, the market share almost went to 55%. Whereas if you look at the market share of Kansai Nerolac, so from 16.7%, the market share has actually just grown to 17.2%. Whereas if you look at the market share of Berger Paints, so the market share of Berger Paints has gone up from almost close to 10.7% to 18.4%, and they also give this data in their investor presentation. So recently the market share has crossed 19%. Whereas if you look at the market share of AkzoNobel, which is also known as Dulux, so AkzoNobel market share has actually declined from 18.7% to almost 9.7%. So single digit market share is left. So this was the market share analysis of the organized players. Now I'll come to a very, very interesting and a very, very important point, that what is the total capital that is employed in the industry, and why Grasim and JSW want to enter this industry, and what can happen potentially going forward. So if you are an Asian Paints investor, or if you're interested in the business analysis of Asian Paints, be very, very careful for the next 5 minutes, because I need your full concentration to fully understand that whenever a new competitor enters an industry, what ends up happening and what is the incumbent doing to defend itself, and what can be the long-term implications. Now let's look at the industry profit pool and how the industry capital employed has grown. Because this is a very, very important data point, because this will make you realize that how Asian Paints is going to defend itself, and also how the second, third and fourth players might be in danger when it comes to the return on capital employed. So if you look at the entire industry's profit pool, then you will get that out of the top 5 players, the entire industry's profit pool is currently close to 5200 to 5500 crores. That is something that we can take a rough benchmark if we compare the top 4 to top 5 players. If I put AkzoNobel over here as well, then the overall profit pool will go somewhere close to 54 to 5500 crores. That is the organized players, the largest 4 or 5 players, how much money are they making? That is close to 5500 crores. If you look at the revenue of the largest 4 players, it is close to 52,288 crores. But now if you look at the capital employed, so what is capital employed? Basically the debt and equity that is involved in the entire industry. So if you look at the capital employed of the top 4 players within the industry, then the capital employed comes somewhere close to 23,954 crores. So the capital employed is somewhere close to 24,000 crores for the entire industry at the moment. And now if you just look at the 2 players which are trying to enter the business, one is JSW Paints and second one is Grasim Industries. So why are both these companies in the first way, why are they trying to enter this business? It's a common question that you must ask yourself. So Grasim Industries, which has sales of nearly 1,12,000 crores, gets a market capitalization of nearly 1,10,000 crores. So it trades at a market cap of 1x price to sales. Whereas if you look at the return on capital employed of Grasim Industries, then it is barely close to 10 to 12%, because it has multiple businesses. It has multiple businesses like cement, then it has businesses which are into textiles, then it has multiple businesses which are into chlorine chemicals. So that is one reason. Second reason is, if you look at JSW, then again JSW is a business which has a lot of other businesses like steel, power production and all these businesses. And these businesses again are very, very volatile in nature. And sometimes you will make 10% return on capital employed, in some years you will make 30%, and in some year you will even make losses. So for both the groups, what is the problem? That is volatility. First problem is volatility, and second problem is lower return on capital, and third problem is that in spite of having sales which are nearly 4x of Asian Paints, you get a valuation which is nearly, you can assume nearly 10 or 15% of Asian Paints, in spite of having sales which are much larger. So this is something which corporate groups often see. And this is why, because both the companies have the strength in their balance sheet, both the companies announce capacity expansions within the paints industry. And if you look at Grasim Industries capex plans, so Grasim Industries capex plans are much more aggressive than JSW. So there's a reason behind that as well. But Grasim Industries capex plan currently is close to 10,000 crores when they enter the industry in Q4 of FY24. And this entire capex plan, so this was also clarified in the con calls. So this entire capex plans is to set up the production capacities. Whereas for JSW, if you look at their current production capacities, it is close to 1 lakh kiloliters. And they plan to expand this production capacity to 3 lakh kiloliters. So they're adding 2 lakh kiloliters in next 2 to 3 years. And they are also doing additional capex of 750 to 1000 crores. And currently JSW Paints is already doing sales of 1000 crores, whereas Grasim Industries is still coming up. And in this sale of 1000 crores, as we discussed in the beginning of the video, 50% belongs to industrial paints and 50% belongs to decorative paints. And decorative paints is the industry where real barriers to entry exist. So currently decorative paints, the sales are much lesser as compared to industrial paints. But even JSW Paints wants to take their mix to 80% of decorative paints and 20% of industrial paints going forward in the next 2 to 3 years. And also JSW Paints, they plan to have nearly 10,000 retail touch points by FY25, FY26. That is in next 2 to 3 years from now. And if they have 10,000 retail touch points, probably they'll end up becoming the 5th or 6th largest player in the industry. So that is with the moat attack which JSW Paints is trying to do. But now the much serious competition which can arise is from Grasim Industries. And if you look at the economics of Grasim Industries and what they are trying to do, so Grasim Industries actually manufactures putty. Putty, it comes under the name of Aditya Birla Group, and you might have heard about Birla Wall Putty. So actually currently what is happening is that they have 54,000 dealers for Birla White, and out of which 70% of them are already suppliers for paint industry. So again, if you look at the economics, so currently Grasim Industries is planning to enter the industry, and out of 54,000 dealers for Birla White, 38,000 dealers are already selling paints out of them. So there is a cross-selling element that is there, because those dealers are already selling Birla White, so they can stock up paints. That is the thesis of the management. Capacity, if you look at Grasim currently, so they have announced a capacity of 13.32 lakh kiloliters. Whereas entire capacity for Asian Paints is currently close to like 17 to 19 lakh kiloliters, and they are planning to take it to 26 lakh kiloliters. Whereas for Grasim, this will be the second largest capacity that comes on stream within the industry. And their capex plan is close to 10,000 crores, and they are setting up 6 new plants, whereas JSW is setting up 3 new plants. So again, this gives you an idea that currently, even though like Grasim industry wants to enter the industry, entire industry's invested capital pool or capital employed pool is close to 24,000 crores, and 2 new companies have entered the industry, and they're deploying nearly 50% of the entire capital employed within the current industry. And also what is happening that all the existing players have announced capexes, and because if existing companies are doing capex, then the capital employed pool of this industry is going to grow. So there is a risk that there might be oversupply over the next 2 to 3 years, and there is also a risk that it can lead to a pricing war as well. But this is something that you have to take in mind, because while we are doing valuations of the company, we'll also find out what is happening. But now let's look at the reaction of Asian Paints to this massive capacity expansion by Grasim Industries. So what Asian Paints has done is that Asian Paints itself has announced its own capacity expansion of 8,750 crores. So Asian Paints has responded to the competition by expanding a massive backward integration, that is into VAM, VAE and white cements. So these backward integration, what does backward integration mean? Is that you are going to produce your raw material in-house. So Asian Paints has announced almost a 2,000 crore plus capex into this. And why is Asian Paints doing this right now? Because allowing or controlling the cost of your raw material will also allow you to price your products competitively. And if JSW and Grasim decide to go ahead with a pricing war, then even Asian Paints can easily compete with them, because they'll be one of the only integrated players into VAM, VAE and also white cement. So this will also be very, very accretive for them. But this is something that Asian Paints is doing to defend itself. But the smaller players like Kansai Nerolac, AkzoNobel, and also the unorganized players or players like Indico, these players do not have more than 2,000 crores lying around to do backward integration capex. So what can end up happening is that Grasim and JSW, if they announce even more massive capacities over here, and if they spend a lot on branding in this industry, so the smaller players, their market share can be taken away, and there the price to earnings ratio can actually derate. But for Asian Paints to derate, or for Asian Paints or for Asian Paints economics to suffer of the business, what we need to remember is that because a lot of capital is coming into this industry, so there is a chance that your return on capital employed ends up falling. Because for Grasim, remember, the return on capital employed is close to 10 to 12%, so they'll be happy with a 20% return on capital. But for Berger and Asian Paints, the return on capital is somewhere between 35 to 40%. So what can possibly happen or probably happen in this industry is that your denominator, that is your capital employed within the industry, ends up increasing massively, whereas your growth, that is your EBIT growth, is still very, very linear, that is with your volume growth 12 to 14% type. So in this scenario, what can happen is that your incremental return on capital can go down. Second scenario, what can potentially happen is that if there is actually a pricing war within the industry, or if the margins go down. So earlier Asian Paints used to guide for 21 to 22% EBITDA margin, but now they're guiding for 17 to 20% EBITDA margin. So if your margins end up going down, so second potential threat that can happen within this industry is that if your EBIT margins fall, then again your return on capital employed will go down. So that is the risk that the market is perceiving right now. But Asian Paints, by far, I think within the industry, is the most competitively well-suited player, and it has established moats which no other company in the industry has established. I think even compared to Berger Paints, Asian Paints moat is much deeper and wider than the other players. So what can potentially end up happening is that Grasim and JSW can snatch away market share from the other smaller players which are there in paints. So this is with the competitive intensity that is playing out within the industry. And you also let me know in the comment section below, what do you think, whether Asian Paints can actually retain its market share and expand its market share, or what will happen, whether the second, third or fourth player will end up losing some of their market share. Do let me know in the comment section below. With this, we'll go to the technical analysis and also the valuations of Asian Paints. So हम trading view के ऊपर आके what we'll do is that we'll do the technical analysis of the entire paint sector, because almost 40% of a stock's move is attributed to what the group is doing. Group, that means what the sector is doing. So over here I have Nerolac, Asian Paints and Berger Paints. So first I'll start with the technical analysis of Berger Paints. If you look at Berger Paints right now, what has happened is that the relative strength line, so this is known as relative strength. So I've opened monthly charts, and on monthly charts I'm checking the relative strength of Berger Paints versus Nifty. So if this blue chart goes below 0, then it means that the relative strength of Nifty is much better than Berger Paints, and Berger Paints is relatively underperforming Nifty right now. So Berger Paints relative strength line has gone below 0 after nearly 2019. If you look at this entire phase, this was the entire phase of outperformance of Berger Paints versus Nifty. That is between this entire phase. And now recently the relative strength line has gone below 0. So over here for Berger Paints. And this is not only one stock phenomena within the paints industry. Now let's look at the technical analysis of Asian Paints. Now currently Asian Paints is testing almost a 12-year-old trend line right now. And also if you look at the relative strength line of Asian Paints, again over here the relative strength has gone below 0. Again for Asian Paints, this is something that is happening, which is also happening in Berger Paints. So technically the charts either look in sideways period right now, or some of them even look in a downwards period right now. And what looks in downwards, if you look at Kansai and Nerolac, you'll find on weekly charts, if we use the stage analysis, so this was your entire phase of markup, right? Then consolidation, and then one more period of markup, then stage 3, and then finally drawdown, then finally some whipsaws, and finally currently stage 4 continues in Kansai and Nerolac. So Nerolac is in stage 4 right now, where the stock is being distributed, and relative strength line has gone below, and the relative strength line on a weekly chart has gone below 0. So this is the technical analysis point of view, that all the three paint companies, currently Asian Paints is in a sideways trend and is testing a 12-year-old trend line, whereas Berger Paints is relatively underperforming Nifty, even Kansai and Nerolac is relatively underperforming Nifty, and even Asian Paints is relatively underperforming Nifty. So that is something that is happening within the entire sector itself. Finally, coming to the valuations to complete this entire analysis of Asian Paints, is that now what I'll do is that I'll take a PE based approach and assign exit multiples to the stock of Asian Paints. So why are we taking this approach? Because this will give you an idea whether the risk reward is massively in your favor or not in your favor, and I'll post this sheet for you in the description box below so that you can do this exercise independently. So currently Asian Paints FY23 or trailing 12 month sale are close to 33,595 crores. Whereas EBITDA margins are somewhere between 17.38%, whereas your PAT margins are close to 11.34% and your PAT is close to 3,811 crores. Now let's assume that the EBITDA margins stay at 17% till FY30 and Asian Paints sales keep growing at 12 to 14% range, 12% growth, 12% growth, 12% growth, 12% growth, 12% growth, 12% growth, and by FY30 we have a scenario where Asian Paints total sales are close to 74,266 crores, whereas Asian Paints EBITDA will be close to 12,625 crores and Asian Paints profit after tax will be close to 8,392 crores. At that point of time, if Asian Paints gets an exit P of 70 times, so your market cap will be close to 5,87,441 crores. That is nearly more than double from here. That is a stock price close to 6,000. Whereas your CAGR return will be close to 11.58%. Whereas now if we assume that the margins they end up increasing, now let's assume if the EBITDA margins go to 20% and if the PAT margins go to 14%, then over FY30 your total EBITDA margins will be close to 20% and your total EBITDA will be close to 14,853 crores and your profit after tax will be close to 10,400 crores. And at that point of time, if Asian Paints gets an exit P of 70 times and also you get 0.5% from dividend as well, in that scenario you might make a 15.5 to 16% CAGR. But what if the P ratio derates because of excessive competition within the industry? Then your PE will fall to 50, that is also a chance, and your CAGR might fall to 9.65%. So in the best of the best case scenario, even if we take a 70% PE, if we take a 70 PE as exit rate, even in that scenario, your CAGR is close to 15%. So I've put this sheet in the description for you below and you can make your own assumptions and you can draw a rough metric for valuations. I know people will say ki discounted cash flow matters, some will say reverse DCF matters, some will say you should build a bull some will say you should build a bull, bear and base scenario. Some will say you should take the free cash flows into account. But this is just a rough metric for doing valuations because at the end of the day, a stock price needs to have a PE ratio. And if the PE ratio is very high, then again the risk reward can get skewed. But also you have to remember that this is just a rough metric. So this was the analysis of Asian Paints. Now let's go to the conclusion. So this was the analysis of Asian Paints where we learned about the competitive structure of the Indian paints industry. We also learned about the total addressable market of the Indian paints industry. We also learned about the value chain of the entire Indian paints industry. Then we looked at the business history of Asian Paints, what is required to build a successful paint franchise. We also looked at that with the example of Asian Paints. Then we did a P2P analysis. Then we also looked at why Grasim and JSW want to enter this industry. Then we finally looked at the technicals of Asian Paints and we also did a valuation analysis. And before ending, there are few risk factors which can also be considered. Is that if the raw material prices again rise, then again it can lead to some gross margin compression. And also second risk factor which we have already talked about is the competitive intensity which might increase in the industry. Third risk factor that we discussed was that return on capital employed might end up falling. And finally the risk factor which we can discuss in this video as a part of it is that if Asian Paints keeps getting excess cash, so there could be a point of time that they'll have to keep entering other adjacencies. So there's an element of uncertainty as well whether they'll be able to scale it up or not. And finally I would like to conclude. So again, probabilistically with the entry of new competitors, second, third or fourth or fifth players in the paint industry might end up suffering because Asian Paints scale is much larger than the other ones. And with this backward integration also coming in play, there is also an element that if there is a pricing war, they could still end up controlling their margins. So this was the analysis of Asian Paints. Do let me know in the comment section below whether do you think that the risk is in favor or the reward is in favor. And if you loved this video, just drop a loved it in the comment section and also subscribe to the channel. Thank you so much for joining us. Hope to see you in the next business analysis of SOIC. Jai Hind.